Good morning. Thank you all so much for joining us for War and Peace and Winslow Homer, the Civil War and its Aftermath. One of America's most celebrated artists, Winslow Homer, was on the front lines of the Civil War, documenting battles and moments of quiet contemplation in scenes that have come to define the conflict. Homer's paintings after the war show a beautiful, if uneasy, peace in America. And this is all led this morning by art historian Jane Oneail, who's the founder of Culturally Curious, a company that curates and delivers art appreciation programs for audiences worldwide. With a master's in art history from Boston University and a master's in education from Harvard University, Jane has worked at some of New Hampshire's most esteemed cultural institutions, including as executive director of the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, as well as the senior educator at the Currier Museum of Art. Jane has also taught at the college level for more than a decade, most recently at Southern New Hampshire University. I again want to thank the Friends of the Library and the Corning Life Sciences Foundation for sponsoring. I also I'm gonna probably get this wrong here, doing this live. Want to thank the Chelmsford Library and I think the Vineyard Haven Library for helping spread the word. So all nearly 150 of us who are watching live and the many more that will watch the recording, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Jane for joining us today. And Jane, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Robert. Thank you, everybody, for taking a little time out of your day to learn a little bit more about Winslow Homer, to indulge in these gorgeous and really fascinating images. Hopefully, at the end of the hour, you'll come away with a new understanding or renewed appreciation for his work. And like the program description says, I mean, Winslow Homer really was the most celebrated artist of the 19th century, I think continues to be, and I think a favorite artist for so many art historians. I'll talk a little bit more about that along the way. He was someone who launched his career with the Civil War. It's almost hard to imagine, right? And then today we'll be looking at some of his greatest paintings from that era, as well as a handful of exceptional works that came a little bit later. We will be getting back to this incredible image on the screen in just a little while, but let me give you a sense in terms of how we'll spend our time together. Here is our program overview. We'll get started with an introduction to Winslow Homer. He's a little bit of a mysterious guy, so I'll tell you what we do know. And then we'll look at his illustrations of the Civil War and his paintings of the Civil War, his images of Reconstruction, the uneasy piece that follows, and then sort of glimpse his final years there. Now, this is a gorgeous watercolor on the screen that we're not going to get back to, so I just want to acknowledge what's going on here. This is a Civil War era image, and it's called Contraband from 1875. So this is painted well after the Civil War. It's a watercolor, so we see that Winslow Homer was already somebody who's adept in working in a variety of media. Now, just to give you a sense in terms of what's happening here, this is a Union soldier over here on the left, so fighting for the North. And as contraband, this little boy, that would mean that this little boy has escaped from the South, and he isn't yet free. In the Union Army, they referred to escaped slaves as contraband and oftentimes put them to work in service of the Army. But what we're looking at here is this kind of uneasy introduction between these two figures. And there's a good chance that maybe this white figure has never seen a Black person before. Notice how this child is dressed in these tattered clothes and is reaching for this canteen. It's a child in need, but the canteen is still wrapped around the shoulders of this Union soldier who doesn't look like he is quite at the place of offering water to this child. It's a fascinating image, and I think probably gives us a lot of insight into America at that time. And certainly so many of Winslow Homer's paintings do just that. So let's dive into who Winslow Homer was. Here we go with our introduction. The man behind the mustache. What a mustache, right? This is a portrait of the artist done by a fellow artist named Oliver Ingraham Lay. Winslow Homer was just about 30 years old when it was painted. This is in the National Academy of Design, and it was done in 1865. So Winslow Homer was born in 1836, and he grew up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which was still a pretty rural suburb of Boston at the time. He was one of three sons. I think he was the second son. And when he was a child, he was really largely self-taught in terms of the arts. His mother really loved watercolor and probably gave him some instruction and encouragement that way. But he learned the basics really on his own. He didn't necessarily attend art school. At the age of 19, after graduating from regular high school, he began a career as a lithographer's apprentice in Boston for a man named J.H. Buford. And let me give you a sense in terms of what he was doing. He was essentially replicating images using a lithographer's stone, which we can see over here on the left. And most of the images that he was making were they were like covers for sheet music. And I won't belabor the process of lithography because I'm not an expert in it, but it involves chemicals. It involves using this greasy crayon and creating washes that kind of resist water, and you press it up against the stone. So it was a process that Winslow Homer did not necessarily love. He called it a treadmill experience, even at this young age. But occasionally he did get to do a few of his own images for music, sheet music covers. And this is a design that he did before the age of 20 for a polka tune called The Rat Catcher's Daughter. And it just gives us a little bit of insight into his early art. We can see the rats and the cats and all of these various elements that are kind of unified by this ribbon here wrapping around our central figure. But this wasn't necessarily uh, feeding his soul as an artist. So it was within a short amount of time that he moves to Boston and opens up his own shop. He's just 21 years old at the time. And this was just a fortuitous time to do this because there was like this growing demand for illustrations for magazines and that sort of thing. So what we're looking at here is his depiction of the Boston Common from 1858. And if you're really familiar with downtown Boston, you might even recognize this particular spot. Now, Winslow Homer was especially good at capturing changing styles in fashion. He knew where, the new ruffles were. He knew where there was a new simplicity to address. He could get it all into his print, and I think people really appreciated that about his images. So, as a freelancer, he's submitting work to magazines such as Harper's and Ballew's Pictorial. And in 1859, in the just few years leading up to the Civil War, he moves to New York City, where he launches his own studio called in the 10th Street Studio building. And when he was offered a contract as a staff artist for Harper's in 1860, he actually turned it down. Listen to this. This is the language that he uses is so interesting to me. He said, "The slavery at Buford's was too fresh in my recollection to let me care to bind myself again. From the time I took my nose off that lithographic stone, I had no master and never shall have any." So here he is talking about his own work in the language of slavery, which of course is a major issue in the United States at this time, and certainly a subject that will become very familiar to him through his art. So here he is on the cusp of launching a career as a painter, but then the Civil War starts, and Winslow Homer is actually sent to the front lines by Harper's Weekly to document what he saw. Now, here is an image of Winslow Homer that is oftentimes reproduced. And I get a little bit of a chuckle seeing these two images side by side, because for the longest time, this is how I thought of Winslow Homer, the image over here on the left with the straw hat. And then I just, in my research, came across the alternative image where he's holding the hat and we can see that he's bald. It's just I just didn't know that. And I think that speaks to Winslow Homer's character in a certain way because he was an enigmatic figure. He had no public life. There are no journals that he left. There are very few letters. He never took on students. He never trained people to work in his style, never had a protege. He said at the end of his life, when biographers were knocking down his door, he said, "The most interesting part of my life is of no concern to the public. I must decline to give you any particulars in regards to it." Um, Furthermore, Winslow Homer didn't seem to have any close friends to speak of. He never married and had no known romantic relationships. And if we're just thinking in terms of his ability to provide, he would not have he was not successful enough to even support a marriage or a family until he was well into his 40s. So art historians love to speculate as to which women in his canvases may have broken his heart or may have prompted a lifetime of solitude and secrecy. Now, we do know that he was extremely close to his parents and very attached to his older brother. And as we're looking at him in these photographs, you can see he was a very sort of slight and wiry man, elegant in dress and bearing, but obviously prematurely balding. And he had this very large mustache that he seemed to kind of hide behind. And although he earned some critical acclaim early on in his career, sales remained slow for him. I mean, the country was in turmoil too, so who's buying a lot of art? Now, romantic failure might be another reason for the secrecy that kind of shrouds his life. And the pretty women that we'll see in his, especially his post-war images, have again, it got a lot of us thinking which one of them he might have been most fond of. Okay, so we don't know much about Winslow Homer, but it would probably come as no surprise to anybody that he never left a self-portrait. There does seem to be this notion that maybe he hides his true self in some of these photographs, but I wanted to share this very late image from Winslow Homer as an example of what some Winslow Homer scholars think can sort of function as a self-portrait. This is called The Fox Hunt from 1893, and it's actually the biggest painting he ever made. It's 6 feet wide. Um, and what we're looking at here is a scene from Maine, and this is sort of the last chapter of his career when he's already up living in Maine. And it's like this desperate scene of hunger in the middle of the winter. So we do get the familiar rocks and waves breaking in the distance, but we also see this fox that is out desperately looking for food. And there's this group of crows, a murder of crows, right, that are coming to attack the fox as he's desperately looking, not only now for something to eat, but also some sense of cover here. And there's very few places to go, especially since the ocean's here. So why would anyone think that this orange fox darting through the snow might represent Winslow Homer? Well, one of the little signs to suggest this is actually Homer's signature. You might be able to see it down here at the bottom. He actually wrote his own name sinking into the snow in the same way that this fox is sinking into the snow. And furthermore, he takes the tail of that letter R and he gives it this nice little flourish, very much like the tail of the fox. So I think a lot of art historians like to surmise that Winslow Homer thinks of himself a little bit like this fox. He's sly. He's got this social aloofness. There's that elegantness, the shrewdness to him. So there's certainly some sort of correlation between Homer and the fox himself. Now here is a later photograph of Winslow Homer, and we're going to use this just to kind of wrap up on who he was. And I should say that Winslow Homer has been a favorite for male art historians for generations. I've had so many art historians so many art history professors, I should say, male art history professors that just kind of treat him like a god. And I think because there is something about the subjects that he created, a lot of them are just like these solitary male figures doing very masculine things. And the very notion that he launches his career in the middle of a civil war that make him really interesting to to male audiences. If you're a woman watching this right now, don't be afraid. There's plenty here for us as well. But I think that there's something deeply masculine about the paintings that Winslow Homer created, and they have been maybe to a certain degree like over celebrated by generations of male art historians. So and when I say over celebrated, I just mean that he's been the focus of scholarship when, of course, there were plenty of women at work at the same time. Okay, so let's turn our attention now. Oh, and I should just say these are gorgeous little watercolors. One is Waterfall in the Adirondacks here from 1889, and then Ranger in the Adirondacks from 1882. Okay, so let's turn our attention now to directly to the Civil War and consider some of the logistics and then some of the images as well. This is a really complex image. I'm going to let you feast your eye for a little bit as I talk about the Civil War and his part in it. This is called News from the War from June 1862. Now, in 1861, Winslow Homer is this largely self-taught correspondent, and he makes the first of three trips to to sketch what's happening on the front lines of the Civil War for the pages of Harper's Weekly. And the result is some of the most important visual reports on the war. And you can imagine these were the kinds of images that people were starved for. They really wanted to know what was happening in the war, what was happening to their loved ones. People were desperate for this information. So they were just absorbing these images like sponges. Now, Harper's Magazine played this outsized role in American culture at this time. One art historian referred to it as sort of functioning like Life magazine and all of TV rolled into one. So there was this sense of like entertainment, but also information. It was the go-to when it came to finding information. Now, readers were very interested to see images of the war, and photography was still such a time-consuming process, and the equipment for photography was so cumbersome that there wasn't a lot of war photography in these magazines. So the publishers are eager to capture some sort of sense of the visuals, so they're relying on artists like Winslow Homer for their work. And and I should mention too, the process here is that Winslow Homer, working in the front, would create sketches and then send them off to New York City, where then they would be translated into a print. So what we're looking at here with news from the war, we can see a variety of little scenes here, vignettes, and maybe the top and the most dominant image is this woman who is leaning on a table in sadness. She's just emotionally crushed by the war news that she's just read. So she has probably lost someone. There's this emotional pain here, and that's echoed by the physical pain of the soldier just alongside her to the right, who has lost a limb and is now using crutches. Now, there's all sorts of things unfolding here, but I do just want to draw your attention to the artist who is sitting on this barrel here and is rendering an image of these soldiers who are standing at attention, sort of impossibly tall soldiers, right? It's probably not a stretch for us to imagine that this could be another self-portrait of the artist at work. I mean, certainly it would make sense for him to portray himself in this important role of sending these images back home. Now, here is another Civil War illustration that he did, and I'm just going to fill in a little bit more detail too about the war. I mean, it was really the first big visual event of our country. If you think about it, there was no other big unifying event that people were as concerned about, and so for a broad swath of the public in the North, these images defined the war for them. And I think to a certain degree, they still define the Civil War for all of us today. Now, Harper's, his publisher, took a side in the war. And we always think of journalists, journalism as trying to be this neutral act, even though we still struggle with that today, right? Um, but but in this case, Harper was published in the North, and they were very much supporting the Union effort. So that influences some of the scenes that we'll be looking at as well. Now, the Southern New Hampshire, the Southern publications, they didn't have the money, they didn't really have the means of production, and they didn't have skilled engravers in order to make these kinds of images. So it's really the Union-sided imagery that has won out in terms of telling the story of the war. Harper's had about 200,000 subscribers during this time, and you can imagine that these images would have been distributed amongst people and their friends, so everybody was seeing them. And Homer was paid about $25 for each of his illustrations. Just to give you some context, one of the soldiers that we're looking at here would probably have been paid less than half that for a week of service. So he's doing pretty well. Now, the image that we're looking at right now is called the Union Cavalry and Artillery, starting in pursuit of the rebels up the Yorktown Turnpike from 1862. And so we have all of these elegant horses springing forward or sort of back into depth here. And there's just a couple of details that I think are really fun to look at. The campsite in the distance. And then if you have really good eyes, there's actually a hot air balloon up here in set against the clouds. And hot air balloons were used for reconnaissance. It's hard to imagine, but to me, I didn't know that before I saw this image. And it just adds the sense of fantasy and whimsy, just thinking about these battles raging on and a hot air balloon maybe floating by. Now, the first image from the Civil War that I really wanted to delve into with you, this is one of his most celebrated. This is Homer's depiction of the violent fray, a bayonet charge during the Battle of Seven Pines in Virginia in 1862. Now, the Civil War was probably one of the last wars in which men were asked to leave their position in their trenches to charge enemy lines. We know that this is the best way to get yourself killed, right? So we sort of abandoned this technique to a certain degree once we hit the 20th century. But we still had these cavalry charges in the 19th century. And this is the moment where those two lines come into contact with each other. Here we see the Union Army on the left rushing, using their bayonets against these Confederate soldiers. And of course, the bayonet is the little spear at the end of the rifle. It's unlikely that Winslow Homer was this close to see this battle firsthand. So instead, he's relying on some artistic conventions to portray this battle. We see an array of expressions on the faces of these soldiers in the line. Some have anger, some have fear, some have the sense of determination, but there's a real immediacy in terms of the danger and the chaos on the battlefield. It appears as though there's already been a couple of casualties. We've got this one figure here whose elbow points up to the sky, his head points up to the sky, and his knee is bent here. He has maybe been shot, perhaps by the Civil War sniper that we see in the foreground, who seems like this kind of serene figure here who's kind of set apart from the battle. Notice that he does not have a bayonet, so he's probably firing his weapon from a distance. He may have already shot the drummer boy here as well, who's falling forward onto his drum and has dropped his drumsticks here. So this is for Harper's Weekly's audiences too, really a rare opportunity to see soldiers fighting in the midst of the Civil War. And you can imagine if you had a loved one who was fighting, this was your understanding of what they were going through. This was the true news reporting for the time. So there's no clear winner to this battle. And instead, Homer is just giving us this sense of this Union momentum during this moment. And I'm sure that that would have given a lot of people in the North some reassurance in terms of how this war was progressing. All right, this next scene here from Winslow Homer is one of his most famous. It's called An Army of the Potomac, a Sharpshooter on Picket Duty from 1862. Now, in an era where armies are still charging at each other across big open fields, there was no honor really in this idea of somebody hiding up in a tree, camouflaging their position and sitting there with this powerful rifle that could take someone out. This was a horrifying image to Winslow Homer, to the readers of Harper's Weekly, because certainly both armies had snipers like this. In this case, we are looking at a Union soldier, and he is looking through this telescopic viewfinder in order to take aim at a target and to eliminate a life in this moment. So this was a fairly new modern technology that could hit a victim, an unsuspecting victim, from up to about a half a mile away. This was a haunting image for so many people when they saw it. And let's take a look at the composition here. This Union soldier is balanced somewhat precariously on this tree branch here. We can see that his foot is sort of wedged between the branch and the trunk. He's leaning with both his arm and his rifle on this upper kind of skinnier branch here. And then he's tied his canteen to another branch. And there's something about the composition that you almost feel like you're looking at scales, like there's this sense of a balance here. And for uh, soldiers who were fighting in this war, the idea of a sharpshooter camped out somewhere where you couldn't see them was so anxiety producing. People would have like a nervous collapse just waiting around for battles to begin because you just didn't know if you were in somebody's crosshairs. And Winslow Homer actually had the opportunity to pick up one of these rifles and looked through the scope. You can see that he's drawn a little sketch in terms of his experience with that, looking at somebody's body through the crosshairs. He writes, "This is what I saw." He said, "I looked through one of their rifles once. The impression struck me as being as near murder as anything I could ever think of in connection with the army. And I always had a horror of that branch of service." So here he's created this image that where he could kind of share that horror with the rest of the public in the midst of the war. So we're going to move kind of quickly through the next few images just to give you a sense of the breadth and the variety of the things that he was documenting. This is an image of wounded soldiers. It's from 1862. And it's actually one of his most sought after images in terms of people collecting, because we see some medical work, some surgery happening here too. But we see a variety of the ways that wounded soldiers were sort of taken away from battle and helped along. So we have a standing figure at the center who might be the least wounded out of all of them, but he's getting help taking his backpack off. We have a soldier lying down over here on the left who's being treated by a physician, and another one over here who seems to have a wound in his chest. Somebody else is being carried from the battle that's raging in the distance. We've even got a wagon bringing people in, another figure on a cot, somebody else who's being brought in on the left. So it's an image that's dense with information. We see a variety of treatments and care being bestowed upon these figures. Now, in this next image, we begin to see another topic that Winslow Homer takes up quite a bit, and it's like the downtime when you're fighting a war, because you can't be fighting constantly. This is a depiction of a scene from a Union soldier's camp life. This is from 1861. And so we see Union soldiers relaxing around this campfire. They're being entertained by music. We've got a figure over here who's playing the fiddle, and by dancing. And these are presumably free Black men or perhaps contraband. Notice here too that Winslow Homer is using some pretty garish caricatures and stereotypes in order to portray those Black figures. We're going to see a whole evolution around this subject as we move along, but we've just got the details of these figures in these more or less relaxed moments during the war, even figures playing cards here in the foreground, kind of set in silhouette. He gives us other scenes where soldiers are missing home. This is a Thanksgiving Day scene in the Army, published in 1864. And we can see the meal has just been consumed. The knife that's in the table is not here for violence, but for carving up a turkey, presumably. And these two soldiers are going to pull the wishbone apart. And we both know what either one of them would wish for. They would wish for the war to be over and for them to be able to go home. Look at this sort of distant, far off expression here of the soldier that seems to be leaning in, interested in who's going to win this wish. It's like they're all thinking of that same wish that they might have in this moment. Okay, so just sort of moving quickly along, this is another image from Civil War that I was always really interested in. It's called Our Women and the War from 1862. And we have Winslow Homer paying homage to all the different ways women have been contributing to the war effort. Certainly, later generations of illustrators like Norman Rockwell will take up the same subject and create like the famous Rosie the Riveter. But here we see more like documentary style images of women, you know, uh, 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 administering to the sick and the dying and helping with bandages and that sort of thing. So there is that celebration of their contributions as well. And sort of just like Norman Rockwell, we also have scenes of reunions. This is an image called Home from War from 1863. And and here, instead of seeing these like unimaginably like scary or scared faces or determined faces or the faces of anger, these are soft scenes of soldiers reuniting with the women in their life, whether it's their mothers or their wives or their girlfriends. And when we look at a scene like this, we also notice that Winslow Homer doesn't really vary the faces of the soldiers. They all look very similar, right? It's like copy and paste and copy and paste. And he sort of does the same thing to a lot of these women as well. He uses this kind of visual shorthand, which was which served him well during this time. So there isn't a lot of variety here, and not too much emotive expression. When I think of like Norman Rockwell being the heir to Winslow Homer, we think of Rockwell being so concerned with the arch of an eyebrow or quirky expression. And here there's a certain solemnity to these scenes, even that when they are joyful reunions. So we wrap up with our look at Winslow Homer's wartime illustrations with this last image here from 1865. It's called The Empty Sleeve. And so this is like a post-war image kind of documenting how life has changed for people following the war. And in this case, we can see a woman and a man sitting in a carriage, and she is holding on to the reins and has the whip in her hand. We can also grasp that this is kind of like a cumbersome task. This is something that requires both hands. The empty sleeve here refers to, of course, the fact that this soldier has lost a limb. He's lost an arm. His sleeve is kind of pinned up into his jacket, so he is unable to do this work. And the woman in his life seems resigned to this new task, and he is sitting here seemingly contemplating how things have changed for him following this war. And an image like this prompts everyone, all the viewers, to imagine how life has changed for so many people. Now, let's turn our attention. We're going to switch gears now and think about Winslow Homer simultaneously launching himself as a fine art artist, as an oil painter in the midst of the Civil War. And in part, he does this based on the success of these illustrations. So he one of his works, which is really considered to be his first finished oil painting, well, it looks pretty familiar to us, right? This is called the sharpshooter from 1863. This is at the Portland Museum of Art up in Maine. So maybe you've seen it before in person. So here he is attempting this career shift while he is so busy during the Civil War. And he's drawing on this print that had created this big emotional wallop for him the year before. So let's do a quick side-by-side comparison here. Obviously, we've got color in one and black and white in the other image. But one of the first things that strikes me as I look at these two images side by side is that the painting allows Winslow Homer to camouflage his subject just a little bit better. Take a look at all of that white space around the figure in the print. You have to make the figure discernible, legible to the readers and the viewers here. So he has to kind of stand out in a way that you know he's there. And Winslow Homer can camouflage him just a little bit better in the painting. Notice he's taken away the canteen here, so it's not really about creating this balanced composition. And now it's really just about the horror of this particular job. He also does not describe the face of this soldier here. This is really about this clandestine work and not being able to know or truly discern where a sharpshooter might be camped out. Okay, so we move on from this first image that is so closely connected to his illustrative work to this next image here, which is called Home Sweet Home. It's from 1863, and this is at the National Gallery of Art, so it's pretty much considered one of his best images from the Civil War. And here there's a sort of a play on words here. Home Sweet Home. Of course, nobody would think of camping out long term as part of a war effort as a sweet home. We can see this low tent here in the foreground, along with these two men. One of them is kind of standing there holding his hip or maybe his back. I'm projecting a little bit here because I don't particularly like the idea of sleeping on the ground, and maybe the romance of like running off to war is kind of wearing a little bit thin. We can also see this figure over here looks kind of contemplative or maybe a little bit bored even too. I mean, there's the romance of war, there's the excitement of war, but then there's a lot of downtime. Home Sweet Home also plays off this idea of like when you're home, you can get a nice home cooked meal. In this case, these soldiers are eating hardtack, and there's really nothing romantic or wonderful about that. But the key to understanding this picture is actually back here in the middle ground. If you've got very good eyes, there's a lot of instruments back here, some big brass horns. And oftentimes during the Civil War, the Union Army and the Rebel Army were camped close enough to each other that when they weren't fighting, when there were these long stalemates, the army bands would sort of spar with each other throughout the day. So the Union Army might play the Star Spangled Banner, and then the Confederate Army might play Dixie or something like that. And they would go back and forth all day, and they would kind of like rile up the troops. And there was like this sense of excitement just around the music there. And then around dinner time, after a day of rousing music, each of the armies would play together, apparently, this song called Home Sweet Home to kind of calm everybody down again. But it's like this moment of sadness and reflection on all that you're missing out at home and the people that you love at home and the sacrifices you're making in this particular time. So a lot baked into this one image. Now, Winslow Homer painted some incredible images about the war itself, about battles. This is an 1864 image called Defiance, inviting a shot before Petersburg. And this is an imagined composition because in this case, we are behind enemy lines. We are with the Confederacy in this particular image. Now, one of the things that would happen during the Civil War is there would be these long delays before a battle. Essentially almost like a siege, and there was no real way for this battle to start. We can see all of these trees have been cut down, and there's sort of this barricade here that the soldiers are hiding behind. Why do you cut down the trees? You don't want any sharpshooters around. And so this Confederate army is probably just kind of going crazy, waiting for something to happen. So this figure here that is up on the barricade, this is our defiant figure who's inviting a shot. The only reason you would do that is because you're sort of going mad with the boredom. And if you've got good eyes, you can probably see a couple puffs of smoke here in the distance because the Union Army is using him as a target in this moment. So this could be the moment in this constructed imagined painting where the battle actually begins because some brave or foolhardy figure is willing to put their body out there. So this is like the very opposite of that hidden sharpshooter up in the tree who is camouflaged and safe and sound, but able to take out someone's life. And here is somebody who's willing to put their full body forward in what could be considered an act of bravery. And what we do know a little bit from Winslow Homer and from his writings is that he found much more nobility in this kind of behavior than in the clandestine efforts of a sharpshooter, even though this is the Confederate Army here. Now, one last thing to note, of course, is this black figure behind the Confederate lines here. This is Winslow Homer painting, again, a very negative caricature, a stereotype of an African American playing a banjo and looking more like a cartoon character than a lot of the other figures he was painting at this time. And we'll see that this racist stereotype, which is the kind of visual imagery that proliferated during the 19th century, is something that he's going to turn his back on in short order. Okay, so this next image here is maybe one that you've seen in person if you're up here in New England. This is at the Harvard Art Museums. It's called Pitching Quoits from 1865. It's a very large painting, about 4 feet wide, 2 feet high. And it was Winslow Homer's first large-scale painting of the Civil War. And it's fascinating to me that once he gets this giant canvas, he's not painting a battle. He's painting nothing grand in this moment. It's not like the heroism of someone or a fallen soldier, like a martyrdom of somebody else. Instead, it's a moment of leisure at a Union encampment. And this game of pitching quoits is sort of like horseshoes. Basically, you can see the horseshoes on the ground. They're just kind of doing like this fun little target practice. Now, what about these uniforms, right? This is a group of soldiers from New York. They were called the Zouaves, and they had a particular uniform that was fashioned after Algerian mercenaries, if you can believe it. And you'd think that they'd have learned from the Revolutionary War that wearing red in wartime is not a great idea. But because like I think during one particular battle, like 3/5 of all the Zouaves were killed. So maybe some of these figures are actually contemplating that loss. But for the most part, it's just a scene of rest, relaxation, and maybe even a little bit of boredom. This also reminds us too that Winslow Homer was very interested in fashion. So of course he's going to be drawn to these men with these big baggy pants and the distinctive red hats here as well. Now, with this next image, we begin to see things changing for Winslow Homer. This is an image that's oftentimes referred to, it's got a couple of different names. Sometimes it's called Army Teamsters. It's oftentimes referred to as the Bright Side from 1865. And it represents this kind of new departure in Winslow Homer's work where we begin to see maybe some more sympathy, maybe some more empathy for Black figures. So these men would have been considered contraband. They would have most likely been men who had escaped the South, escaped slavery, and then sort of become workers for the Union Army. So we can see them in this moment of relaxation. There are 4 men here, 1, 2, 3, 4. They're all wearing different styles of hats that refer to the Confederate Army, or I'm sorry, the Northern Army. And then one additional figure who's kind of comically poking his head out of this tent. But these four men are in a state of relaxation. Maybe some of them are even sleeping here. One of them in the foreground very prominently has a whip in his hand, and that would refer to these mules and the wagons in the background, because these men would probably be involved with moving supplies and moving food, and so they would have had this tough job of like managing the mules that drove those carriages. The whip, of course, also reminds us of corporal punishment of enslaved people in the South. So now this figure has maybe escaped that kind of life, and now the whip is in his hand. So Winslow Homer might be reminding us of that particular change here. Notice that he's not relying on negative stereotypes in terms of the faces here. These seem like fully realized human figures, but some art historians might suggest that Winslow Homer hasn't made a complete 180 from those earlier paintings where he was painting a racist caricature. And the way that they see that maybe some of those lingering prejudicial feelings might still exist in Winslow Homer is that when he has decided to paint naturalistic, realistic Black figures, he is painting them in this moment of rest and relaxation. And that sort of connects it back to the trope of the lazy or the indolent Black man. So I have over here on the left an early genre painting from the 1836. This is painted by the New York artist William Sidney Mount, and it's called Farmer's Nooning. We can see a couple white farmers in the foreground who are also relaxing, but there's a difference here with the way he has painted this Black figure kind of luxuriating in the hay, taking this nap here. And so this notion that in visual culture there and in probably beyond that too, this idea of Black men being lazy. And so here, perhaps Winslow Homer is kind of tapping into that prejudicial notion as well. We can't really say for sure, but maybe this next image will give us a little bit more insight into his particular feelings around this. This is a work called Army Boots from 1865. It's at the Hirshhorn Museum. And again, we see two Black figures, in this case, adorable children, one of them looking out directly at us and smiling. And they are in a tent and playing cards. We can see the cards in front of them, and it almost the way this composition is arranged, it almost makes us feel like we are peeking into this tent, and we've discovered these two little boys just having fun, or maybe slacking off. I mean, again, they are figures in recline. They're not hard at work doing something. And notice the big boots here in the foreground. These little boys are probably contraband of the war, and were most likely in service as valets to Union Army generals or higher ups. So they would have had the job of polishing boots like this, and this is a moment where they are not doing that work. So again, kind of perhaps playing into some of those stereotypes. Now, we're going to shift gears a little bit as we're thinking about these wartime images. And perhaps this is Winslow Homer's most significant wartime image. It's one that is so often reproduced. It's in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's called Prisoners from the Front from 1866. And this is an image that gives us a direct confrontation of North and South without a bloody battle. We have a Union general here who was actually Winslow Homer's cousin, so that probably provided him some access. And we have kind of a shorthand description of what his cousin was able to achieve. His cousin, Francis C. Barlow, was at the Battle of Spotsylvania and Virginia, and he was able to capture, I think, something like a thousand or so troops. And so we have the shorthand for that. We have him confronting just 3 Confederate soldiers here, and they are being guarded by 2 more Union soldiers. And of course, there's some suggestions of the armies in the background, but this is our confrontation. So we have this confident Union general, and he is in direct confrontation with this young man who's almost at the center of the composition. And he is a young, almost like aristocratic Confederate soldier, maybe an officer. And we can see from the way that he's standing and the directness of the gaze that there is a lot of confidence there and a willingness to still confront and have conflict with this general who has captured him. We also see just behind him a much older man, a man so old that you probably wouldn't imagine that he's fighting, but here he is representing the Union Army in this particular moment, and we can see just how tattered his clothes are. He certainly doesn't have the aristocratic bearing of the young man in front of him. And then finally, there's this third figure here whose face is described with a minimum of detail, especially in comparison to this older man in front of him. How are we supposed to understand him? He's got this, what I would call sort of a confident slouch. He's there, he's involved, but he seems like a young man, and there seems to be something almost untamed about him. And if he looks familiar, I would say he's probably the exact same character that we saw before when we were behind Confederate lines. He's that figure that has gone mad and is inviting the shot. Notice how Winslow Homer gives him the same hat and the same wrap around his body that's probably part of his bedding here. And if we zoom in a little bit closer, we can even see that this figure has bullet holes in his hat. So it probably isn't, it probably hasn't been his hat all along, but this is a soldier that has seen some action, right? So we have with this work sort of a continuation of this theme of the nobility of presenting yourself in battle, the that again, this sort of disdain for somebody who is hiding out, who's kind of camouflaged like a sharpshooter, the respect for somebody that you might have who presents his full body in battle heroically, and then maybe a continuation of that over here with prisoners from the front. Now, I was listening to a lecture from a very reputable Winslow Homer scholar, and he talked about how he was a young man in the 1960s during the centennial sort of celebration recognition of the American Civil War. And he said this was the image that was so often represented during that time. And his thought behind that was because it's a somewhat ambiguous image, because you can still see that there is some heroism, some nobility in these confident and defiant Confederate soldiers here. And so no matter which side of the battle you still kind of aligned with, even in the 1960s, that there was a sense of pride for anyone who was looking at an image like this. So that's sort of part of the legacy of this particular standout or stare down between these northern and southern soldiers here. So we wrap up Winslow Homer's Civil War painting with this one last image here that's called Near Andersonville from 1866. Now, what's fascinating is that this image was like lost for like a century. Somebody discovered it in an attic, and these very dedicated Winslow Homer scholars kind of tracked it down and were able to identify it. And now we see Winslow Homer's, I think this is the only time he painted a Black woman during the Civil War, and we can see that she is a fully realized human figure. She's not a caricature at all. And in this moment, he's sort of playing with light and shadow here, suggesting freedom and enslavement. And Andersonville, being near Andersonville, as the title would suggest, recalls a certain horrific passage of the Civil War where Union soldiers were taken to a camp called Andersonville that had absolutely horrific conditions, and about 13,000 Union soldiers died at that camp. And so here's this presumably enslaved woman who's seeing what could have been her hope for freedom being essentially marched to their deaths in this moment. So an image that certainly kind of stirs up emotions in us and sympathy in us as you look at it. So we're going to switch gears now. The war ends. Winslow Homer is still painting, and he creates some of his best paintings, I would say, in this period following during Reconstruction. Some of these images don't seem to necessarily be about the war. This is his painting called Snap the Whip from 1872. It's also at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And it seems like an image of childhood innocence, right? We've got our one room red schoolhouse, we've got the green field, the blue sky, the flowers in the foreground, children playing. I should also mention that this idea of children playing also sets the stage for Norman Rockwell and other illustrators in the 20th century. Artists weren't really painting this prior to Winslow Homer. But in this case, some scholars also see something beyond just innocent play here. And because this is so closely on the heels of the Civil War, some Winslow Homer scholars would suggest that the positioning of these children's bodies is a reference to that war as well. Notice if we start over here on the right, we've got two boys that are trying to hold together. And this idea of holding the Union, and then one that sort of breaks away, a sort of push and pull between these boys, some advancing, some sort of falling behind. And then ultimately, the boy who's been snapped at the end of this whip falls to the ground, similar to the way that the South falls at the end of the Civil War. That's just one reading of it, but I think it's a fascinating reading and probably a plausible one considering what especially this artist has just been through. Now, some of his other paintings following the Civil War are much more clearly references to his wartime experience. This is called Veteran in a New Field, also at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's from 1865. I always say when I see an image of a figure from behind, we project our bodies or we project ourselves into bodies that we see from behind in a painting. We become this soldier, and we know that he is a veteran. We can also see his Union Army jacket over here in his canteen. And here he is not cutting down lives, but cutting down wheat. And there's this immense field in front of him that that he has trouble even seeing beyond, but his eyes are trained downwards as he's focused on cutting this wheat here. Now, before I really knew much about this work, I always thought that Winslow Homer was trying to suggest the movement of this soldier, or of this veteran, I should say, of this now farmer, by showing the blade of the scythe in various positions. But what I have since learned is that he had actually originally depicted something called like a cradle scythe. And in this case, it would have had multiple tines. And in the end, he decided to paint that out. The paint was so thin that we can see through it now. And he opted for something that looks a little bit more like the Grim Reaper and like a single scythe like this. It makes it sort of packs a wallop in this particular image. And we know that as this farmer is engaged in this work, where his mind is thinking about the things that he saw during the Civil War. Now, Winslow Homer also traveled back to the South following the end of the Civil War. He created this incredible work called A Visit from the Old Mistress from 1876. This is at the Smithsonian. You can see that, I mean, his works are so highly celebrated in American history. They're in the best of the museums. This is a startling image, especially considering Winslow Homer is somebody known for his more masculine subjects. In this case, we feel like we have gone into what were the former slave quarters on a particular property where Black women are still living. And the woman who would have been their white mistress prior to the Civil War has entered this space, sort of suggesting that not much has changed in the lives of these women, save for perhaps that this woman on the far left probably would have had to rise when this white woman entered the room prior to the end of slavery. So here, the dynamic has somewhat shifted. look at this kind of look of exhaustion, exasperation, almost defiance in this central figure as she looks at the face of this white woman. Why is she here? What is she asking of them? We can see such a clear class distinction between these women. The white woman wearing a black dress with this elaborate lace collar. Perhaps she lost her husband and is in mourning. But this woman here, this central figure, this impressive figure, is wearing this patchworked dress. The sleeve is ripped open, and there is a directness and really a weariness in this confrontation here that doesn't give us any way forward. We don't know what's going to happen next with these women, and there is certainly something about this composition that might remind you of the prisoners from the front that he had painted just a few years earlier. Again, there was this ambiguity in the relationships here and who you're supposed to root for. Here, I think it's a little bit more clear, but certainly it's a composition that Winslow Homer is consciously using yet again to show this difference between the North and the South. Now, believe it or not, his images were so sympathetic to Black people during the years following the Civil War that his life was threatened. He was kind of chased out of the South for painting images like this. This is his sort of monumental painting called The Cotton Pickers from 1876. This is also at the Metropolitan Museum. And here we see two Black women picking cotton in a field so vast, it looks like it goes on forever. This is post-war, but it doesn't look like their lives have changed at all. The basket here and the gunny sack, they look like they're probably almost filled up, but their work has no end. Winslow Homer cuts them off at the knee. They are mired in this. Their lives aren't going to change, although this gaze at the distant horizon here sort of suggests a longing for something more. Notice that Winslow Homer has painted these women without a reliance on stereotype. Instead, they are fully realized human figures that we are to empathize with. And I mean, you have to have a sense of empathy when you look at the kind of work that is expected of them in this moment. Homer had traveled to France previous to this, and he had been sort of captivated by Barbizon painting, in particular the works of Jean-Francois Millet, who painted kind of heroic peasants who are doing backbreaking labor, carrying heavy things. And so he imbues some of that into these Black women who were still picking cotton in the South. I think it's really interesting that, his post-war images focus so much on these figures in fields who are sort of stuck in these places, sort of navigating forward through these different crops, right, and their relationships to these different crops. Okay, so we're going to wrap up really quickly. I know we're over time here with his final years. We'll just sort of zip through this. Winslow Homer in the decades following the Civil War eventually moves up to Prouts Neck, Maine, and he converts this carriage house that was in his family's property into a painting studio for himself. We can see it's just 75 feet away from the ocean. Here is this wraparound porch, this gorgeous wraparound porch that he had built for this carriage house that functioned as like the greatest studio of all time. Imagine that view. Imagine sitting up here and being inspired by the ocean. And he created all of these. Oh, I should mention too, he became a little bit of a curmudgeon, like a hermit while he's up there, painted a little sign for his studio that said snakes, snakes, and mice to keep people away. So during this time, he creates these unbelievable scenes of heroic, usually like solitary and anonymous fishermen who are battling the elements. And again, these are considered some of his best paintings. They're in some of the greatest collections. We've got the fog warning over here on the left that's at the MFA in Boston. and then the herring net over here on the right, which if I'm remembering correctly, is at the Art Institute of Chicago. And so we can see over here the figure who needs to get back to this little boat or this giant boat on the horizon line, but the fog is rolling in, the waves are high as they are over here in the herring net, where this fisherman is precariously balanced up in these high waves trying to pull this herring net into this tiny rowboat. Eventually, Winslow Homer does away with the figures and he just focuses on the awesome power of the sea and storms along the Maine coast. Here we see these tiny little spindly trees holding on for dear life in a picture called The Coast of Maine from 1893. Here we see another kind of weather-beaten image. This one, I think, is at the Portland Museum of Art, the waves crashing on these very familiar rocks of the ocean, of the Maine coastline. And all of this kind of comes together, gets tied up with a nice little neat bow, sort of, with this final image that I wanted to share with you that Winslow Homer painted not in Maine, but probably inspired by his travels to the Bahamas and to Cuba in right around the turn of the century. He was taking his father to these southern locales to have a warm retreat for Maine. And he was really interested in the people that he saw there. He began to incorporate them into his paintings. And this work called The Gulf Stream from 1899 that he continually reworked until 1906 seems to synthesize all of these things, this interest in the heroism in the water and his experiences documenting the Civil War and Reconstruction. So if we go back to the Gulf Stream for just a moment here, let's go back here, we can see that there is a black figure on a boat here. The boat has been disabled, the mast is broken, and he is surrounded by sharks in the water. There's even like a water spout up here in the distance, and he seems to know that he is done for. There is a boat on the horizon line here. He's gazing in the opposite direction, so he seems to know or that there's no help, or not even know that help is available. It looks as though there's even blood in the water, so there is this suggestion of violence here, certainly, that this black figure is done for. And how does this all relate to everything else? Well, we still have maybe sort of like this indolent figure, a black man in reclining on a boat. Maybe that hasn't changed so much, but there's also some heroism in dealing with these with the awesome power of the sea here. And perhaps Winslow Homer, synthesizing all of these experiences, is really saying around the turn of the century that this is the experience of Black men in America, that they are essentially surrounded by sharks and that there's nobody there to save them, that their experience, that their situation is a disabled boat, and there's not much support for them there. Now, there's a whole history of painting that relates to the slave trade and to black figures being thrown over boats and eaten by sharks. We won't get into all of it. I'm just putting it there to suggest it. But there's a very kind of haunting epilogue to this particular painting where we can see the sharks have like come aboard the boat. There's blood on the deck there, and the figure is now missing. So we wrap up with this fascinating life of Winslow Homer, this fascinating body of work, with this last painting by the artist. Perhaps you can even think of this as a self-portrait. It's called Driftwood from 1909. One of the last things he wrote, he was skipping out on a Thanksgiving dinner, and he wrote to his brother, essentially, he couldn't be there because I am painting. And art historians just love the idea that he is painting. He's like the embodiment of the act of painting and the embodiment of art itself. So he passes away. He is buried in Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, where he grew up. And we can basically just wrap up today with a couple of the big ideas. Winslow Homer was somebody who captured all of the contradictions of life in in during the Civil War and during post-war in America, incredible bravery to go to the front lines and to document what he did, and then incredible empathy to show how the country had changed in the years following that. And we can see that kind of struggle within him continuing to exist even into his later years as kind of a recluse up in Maine. Since we've gone long, I will end there for now, and I welcome any questions or comments you might have about Winslow Homer. I'll start looking at the chat, the Q&A right now. Uh, April asked, what was the medium he used during the Civil War? He was just drawing, so I think he was probably using like pencils, and then those works were being sent to Harper's where they were then engraved. So there's like a whole other artist who is translating his drawings into engravings. Sorry, I didn't make that clear. Robert said, in the painting of the three Confederate soldiers at the front, is there a white flag on the far right that has a red emblem in the middle? Is it a Red Cross flag? Great question, Robert. Let's go back and look. I don't know offhand. In the far right, let's see. Oh, that sort of looks like a Red Cross. You might have noticed that there was something similar to that inside the tent over here, and I think that is like a designation of like a status and order within the army. That is maybe what that is. I could be wrong on that. Robert said, you showed that Homer painted caricatures of Black people. Did he ever own slaves? And two, did he ever change his attitude? Did his attitude about Black people evolve over time? I think we certainly got to that. I don't believe he ever owned slaves. I mean, he was from Boston, so he probably didn't. But I think we saw a clear evolution in his approach to depicting Black people over time, and it's probably comes from the fact that he was able to interact with more Black people as he was down south during the Civil War, and then later during Reconstruction. Francis says, who currently owns Winslow Homer Studios? The Portland Museum of Art does. So you can go and visit that studio on the edge of the Atlantic Ocean. You can buy your tickets online through the Portland Museum of Art. It is well worth it. I haven't gone since it opened, but I did get like a little sneak peek prior to it being opened, and it was a really cool thing to see. They don't have too many artifacts, if I'm remembering correctly, from Winslow Homer's life, but to be able to see that view and imagine his experiences there, ooh, it's amazing. David says, at age 26, how come Homer was not serving in the war? David, that is a great question. I'm not sure. I think he sort of like went into service for Harper's, and that maybe got him out of fighting. That's a really great question. I don't think I have anything in my notes that relates to that, but thank you for asking that. I might have to go explore that a little bit more in depth. Francis, thank you so much for your kind words. And you too, Tish. I appreciate it. Oh, and it's Dave and Cindy. Thank you. Oh, so much for coming. The side-by-side portrait was the image on the left. Photoshop. David, it's so funny that you asked that because I was wondering the same thing. And I was like, oh, have I fallen victim to some sort of AI treatment here or something like that? But you can see he's actually holding the hat in his hand down below. So I think he just did essentially the same pose, took his hat off, I think. And Carol says, was Winslow or anyone in his family part of the abolitionist movement? Great question, Carol. I'm not certain about that. I'm not sure I've ran into anything in my research, but that doesn't necessarily mean yes or no. It's a great question. It doesn't seem to me that he went into this with like deep sympathies towards African Americans because he was still using racist caricatures at the start of the war. And then we see that sort of slowly changing. I'm sure there were a lot of abolitionists in Boston that he probably was familiar with. It's I, without having researched that in depth, I would say just based off the visuals, I would find it hard to believe that he had the strongest sympathies there. But somebody here might know better than me. Jean says, how did he accomplish such details in that time frame, and even the details in the trees in the sharpshooter? Um, it's a great question. I mean, it's hard for us to know what those sketches looked like when he originally created them, and how much the engravers might have added to them along the way. So we can really kind of think of it as a collaboration. But yeah, I mean, you're great to wonder about that. It gets me wondering about it as well. In the reunion drawing, Nancy Parker's here. Hi, Nancy. In the reunion drawing, is the man in the center top holding up a baby? I thought that too. It could, yeah, I think so. Um, some of my Zoom features here make it a little bit hard to see. I'm gonna go back to that in my notes. It's a baby. Yes, I think that's a baby, or maybe, yeah, that's a baby, I think. Um, Robert says the red shamrock on the tent of the Black Boys is that of the Second Corps. Francis Barlow in the third Confederate, in the three Confederate soldiers, was with the Second Corps of the Union Army. So the emblem on the white flag is likely that of the Second Corps. Thank you so much, Robert, for adding that. That element there that sort of looked like a red cross, right? So that's the signifier of their corps, not necessarily their rank. Okay. Somebody else asked, Winslow Homer's father had a black man as a valet. He also worked for Homer at Prout's Neck. Thank you so much for adding that. His first name was Lewis. I believe maybe his last name was Wright. I did not know that. Thank you so much for adding that. Okay, so this kind of changes our understanding of his relationship to Black people during this time, especially even at the end of his life. Um, Madeline says, Homer is one of my absolute favorite artists. I love art because everyone sees something different at the same work. I don't see the Teamsters as indolent. I see them as the same as the other relaxing Union soldiers. This is going back to the Teamsters here. And I see the wagons as empty and the mules resting and grazing. The work is done for the moment. Did Homer leave a catalog listing of his works? Madeline, I love your interpretation, and I love exactly what you said. We can all look at the same thing and see it differently, and there's something so rich in that experience, especially when we share it. I'm not sure if he left a catalog of his works. It's interesting that there are different titles for this one, so I'm not sure if there's like um, uh, one like sort of Rosetta Stone to kind of understanding all of this. It's a great question. David says the people in empty sleeve look like mannequins. I would agree with that, David. There's he relied so much on this kind of copy paste element to these figures here. They were probably just sort of like shorthand, beautiful people for the time, in the same way that we have like a narrow vision of what beauty looks like in today's world. So yeah, they're kind of lacking life here. There's like an emptiness to them that I would agree with. Gonna turn my attention to the chat here. Christine, thanks for your kind words. Let's see. The black and white portrait of Homer, is that a photograph? It looks more like a drawing or a print. I think the question here is from Margot, and it probably relates to this later image here, which I think is a photograph, but I could be wrong. Wow. And she says $25 in 1860 is equivalent in purchasing power to about $950 today. Amazing. Are all the men in the Civil War reportage of a are all of the men in the Civil War reportage a representation of himself? You could probably make that case to a certain degree. I mean, they really seem similar to the images that we saw of him. I mean, going back especially to like this image of him as a young man with the prominent mustache. I mean, when we go to the Civil War, there's a lot of young men who have very similar faces with the prominent mustache, right? It does really seem that that he's using his own likeness as a basis for his reporting. And Margot, you're so good to point that out. Um, that's that is such a great point. And Vivian says he definitely doesn't glorify war. Yeah, I mean, I don't think any one of us would want to be at the front with him, right? Nancy, thank you so much. I appreciate your kind words. Francine says, from what I remember, his paintings from Cuba and Key West, Florida were a very different style and mood with very vibrant colors and scenes. Yes, for the most part, absolutely, they were. The Gulf Stream, that image of the black man in the boat, has a little bit of a different tenor to it. Christine, thanks for your kind words, and Francis and Judy. And and Ron says, my impression of his treatment of faces, hazy, not looking directly at the viewer, using the same face, reflect Homer, the man who left minimal written evidence into his own life, his thoughts. He left mysteries of who he was. He sure did, didn't he? And maybe that meant like he couldn't really penetrate other people's emotional states as well. So he just kind of projected his own self onto them. Great insight there, Ron. And Patricia says, thank you for your kind words, and to EE. And Sharon says, in Home Sweet Home, what is to the left of the tent on the ground? Let's go to Home Sweet Home real quickly. What is to the left of the tent on the ground? I think that's a backpack, if we're looking at the same thing right there. And that's the hardtack, and then a bush and the fire. Hopefully that's helpful. Thanks, Lynn and Catherine and Margot. I really appreciate all the kind words. Jean says, the later slides, especially type Fox, remind me of Wyeth, who seems to share that sense of isolation. Oh, when we were talking about that fox and sort of the hermit that Winslow Homer later began, I definitely would agree with you. Thank you, Frank, for your kind words. I think we got through everyone's questions. Oh wait, Susan said, in the painting of the three Confederate soldiers, doesn't the central Confederate soldier resemble the Union soldier next to him, suggesting the idea of brother against brother? I would agree with you on that. Where'd we go? Right here. Prisoners from the front. Maybe this idea of brother against brother and that kind of direct confrontation. I think, yeah, that's sort of like suggested there, although it might not be um, in fact true, but I think you're touching on that notion that I think so many of us hold in our head when it comes to the Civil War. Um, two men in similar bearing, right? And similar age that way. Madeline says, my great great grandfather was among the Massachusetts Union volunteers. He made it home but died of wound related illness from the Battle of the Wilderness. I always see Homer as showing how much of the Civil War affected individual lives of veterans, the freed citizens, and their families in a new, more industrialized future. His war battlefield works show a preview of trench warfare as the Civil War was in many ways. Thanks for adding that, Madeline. I appreciate it. I think we got to everything, Robert.
I think we did, Jane. So, folks, let's give Jane a big virtual round of applause for another wonderful presentation. She never fails to disappoint, or she never disappoints, I guess I should say.
She never.
That's what I mean. You know what I mean? Okay, it's been a long morning for me. So, folks, we're going to see Jane again in 3 weeks on Thursday, September 12th at 10:30 for the Wyeth family. I guess that's 3 generations of very famous American artists.
That's one of my favorites.
I'm looking forward to it already. So, folks, look for an email from me later today with this recording, as well as information about our September art history programs. And for those watching live, when you leave the Zoom, please take 60 seconds and fill out the feedback survey that should pop up. So, thank you all so much, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. Thanks again, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, Jane.